Hello, my name is Arjon Dunnewind, Director of IMPAKT in Utrecht. Welcome to this documentary that is part of the multifaceted web project Radicalization by Design that I made together with curator Mark Tutus. Radicalization by Design is part of the IMPAKT series, The Grand Narrative, in which IMPAKT investigates the way internet subcultures, new and old mythologies, storytelling and the so-called grand narratives are part of our contemporary political landscape, how they relate to populism and to polarization and radicalization in our society. Originally, this project was planned as 2 public events with a live audience. Because of the outbreak of Corona, we decided to turn these events into an interactive web project. The web project Radicalization by Design brings together visual presentations, films, text, interviews and a panel by 4 experts on new media, politics and digital cultures. This documentary serves as an introduction to the entire web project. We hope it will encourage you to look further into it and navigate the project yourself. As an entry into the Radicalization by Design project, we present to you material from one of its sections, the response videos. For this section, we invited our 4 experts to discuss topics like conspiracy theories, trolling, and the countercultures versus the establishment dichotomy, on the basis of film clips we have selected for them. But before we start with our experts responding to these clips, my colleague Mark Tutus will briefly introduce the overall project and our speakers to you.
In 2015, the web turned dark. There was a proliferation of all kinds of weird, extreme movements and groups, incels, men's rights activists on Reddit, 4chan, Pepe the Frog, Nazi memes, and this brought a lot of scholars and journalists to the problem of kind of reactionary turn or malignant turn in what had previously been seen as participatory web culture, something that had been theorized in very different terms. So this evening's event bring a bunch of these people together from very different perspectives, from the perspective of journalism, from the perspective of the arts, and from the perspective of new media in academia. And we're going to discuss this problem of radicalization from a basically new media perspective. In new media, we think the way that we look at things is in terms of the media, and the media that is the sort of substrate within which a culture would grow, like a petri dish in which a kind of a bacteria could grow. And so that's how we want to think about this. And the scholars this evening will be, who will be joining us are Richard Rogers from the University of Amsterdam, the founder of the Digital Methods Initiative, and a web epistemologist. Dimitri Tokmetzis, a notable expert in extremism online, and a journalist with the Correspondent, very important independent news organization. Florian Cramer, who is a kind of a long-time public intellectual figure in the arts at the Willem de Koning Academy in Rotterdam, and Bharat Ganesh from the Groningen University, an assistant professor in new media. So please join us for this fantastic event.
I think it's hard to say really why it is conspiracy theories are so kind of central in the internet landscape today. I think there's probably a couple ways to think about this. I think the first one is because the internet enables anybody to go out and publish something or publish their own voice, right? It makes it easy to put out conspiracy theories, right? So I think that's the first part of it, right? So especially when we look at social media platforms like YouTube or Twitter, the fact that they're really centered around user-generated content, there's so few kinds of filters that are there to prevent some kind of nonsense theories, for example. I think that's a big reason why we see so much conspiracy theories on the internet. But that's not to say, there were a lot of conspiracy theories before that, but I think the internet is also making them a lot more accessible. So I think that's one of the key aspects about conspiracy theory. But also I think, we also have to think about the times that we're living in, the kind of uncertainty and the challenges that so many people have. Finding conspiracy theories on the internet might help people to confirm certain kinds of existing emotions or beliefs that they have. And that might also play a big role. But I don't think there's a definitive answer to this question about whether or not, or what it is that makes conspiracy theories so effective online.
That's a good question, because for every niche there's a massive audience. I think that's the case. And internet loves niches. So it's so easy to find people who think the same way as you do on the internet. What strikes me more, I'm not surprised that there are so many conspiracy theories going around and that some platforms are so conducive to them. But what surprises me is that those conspiracy theories actually escape and make it into the real world. Like Pizzagate, of course, is one of the infamous cases where the conspiracy theory is this is pizza joint in Washington, and the Democratic establishment is sacrificing children, and they're killing them and burying them in the cellar, which is complete bonkers, of course. But one guy actually believed it with so much passion that he went with his automatic rifle to this place and demanded that the children would be freed. So that's kind of disturbing. And there's a conspiracy theory, I think it was in 2016, 2017, and now it's re-emerging again on TikTok. So it has been debunked so many times. There's so much information available about not being true and it's just being a big crap. And still it resurfaces. It's just amazing.
Well, you could say that conspiracy theory always has to do with networks. It's creating a semantic network. It's connecting the nodes, and it's also, most importantly, connecting the things that are not connected. It's connecting the loose ends. That's what conspiracy theories really are about. So when you're mapping a conspiracy theory, you can almost map it, or actually exactly map it like a network map, where you see, what is its routers, what are its servers, what are the peer-to-peer structures, etc., etc. So, yeah, you could say if you would make a linguistic or semiotic analysis of conspiracy theories, then you would end up with network structures, and that's why the internet is the perfect medium for conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories have been on the web for many, many years. Since the early 1990s, the web was oftentimes called this space of rumor mongers, of self-publishers. So there's nothing new there, but what is new is that they are now being sort of supercharged by social media, and they're being circulated a lot more, and thereby, in some ways, the fringe is being mainstreamed.
I would say maybe not so much or less than we think in qualitative terms. If you think, for example, of classic conspiracy theories like the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the wise men of Zion, it's practically unchanged. Also has been perfectly transported into the internet. Conspiracy theories can be rehashed, and you see that most of them are not very new. Even if you look at a very contemporary, seemingly new conspiracy theory like QAnon, then you see it's just all elements from pre-internet times, even including Q itself, because Q was actually a novel written by an Italian collective, the Luther Blissett collective, in the late 1990s. And the inventors of the QAnon conspiracy theory literally just ripped this novel and repurposed it for pro-Trump conspiracy theory. So That is maybe also the weak point of it. You could say the internet has mostly been something like an incubator and an accelerator. Because it has that web structure, because it lends itself to these kind of narratives, you could say there has been a new quantitative quality in conspiracy theories. The quality hasn't that much improved.
I mean, I really don't know too much about this particular point, so I can kind of speculate, I guess. So what makes conspiracy theories different in the context of the internet? I think one thing that's really probably worth picking up on here when we're trying to think about what it is that's special about conspiracy theories online is we've got these big participatory spaces for people to go out and kind of find that information from a particular conspiracy theory online, right? So what we see with the QAnon folks is they're trying to go out and find all kinds of evidence for the conspiracy theories that they believe in. But it also connects with some of my own research on the alt-right. So the idea that white people are victims in Western countries, right? They are really active. A lot of these alt-right accounts on social media platforms are really active in going out and trying to seek information to sort of prove their existing beliefs or their existing kind of dispositions.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, what has changed now is that we are in a period of time where we've experienced not only the rise of populism and a kind of turn to the right on the web, but these turns have been accompanied with a kind of a new sort of information environment where you have a lot more alternative sources, a lot more alternative views, and many of these you could consider to be conspiracy theories.
Yeah, of course, especially in the right-wing sphere. There's this strange marriage between right-wing extremists and conspiracy thinkers, I think, and the anti-vaccination movement. You sometimes see them together, and right now, for instance, in the Netherlands with the corona crisis, the lockdown is being eased, and there has been some demonstrations of people thinking that we should ease the lockdown even more, and it's not going fast enough. And that's a strange marriage between right-wing activists and anti-vax people, and some other people, of course. They're not all part of this movement, but they know how to find each other. Another one, of course, is a more pernicious one. That's the idea of, how do you call it in English? In Dutch you call it omvolking. It's a theory that the EU, the European Union, is set on basically wiping out the European population, the original white population, by stimulating immigration and therefore making it possible that the white race, as they see it, will disappear. That's clearly a conspiracy theory, but that's a conspiracy theory you actually hear parliamentarians say now, and you see it in mainstream media emerging sometimes. And that's really scary, I think. It's really potent.
Well, of course, the current president of the United States is one of the better known conspiracy theorists. It was a person who spread the birther conspiracy theory around Obama, for example, and is an active spreader or circulator of conspiracy theories through his Twitter account. So it goes right to the top at the moment. But you also have other politicians, largely on the right, largely populist ones, who peddle in this kind of information. Some far more than others, but it is not unusual nowadays, whereas I guess you would have thought it to be rather unusual in the past, to see politicians peddling these sorts of views.
Yeah, I think the new quality really is that online conspiracy theories influence the political landscape. Just today, it was on the news that 2 Republican candidates have been chosen in the USA who are supporters of the QAnon conspiracy theory. So what we get is a kind of breakdown of, let's say, the realm of fiction for conspiracy theories, which, but then is not such a new thing. I mean, mainly historically, we could say that conspiracy theories were mainly political, roughly from the late 19th century to fascism, where there are also political tools. And then we had, after the Second World War, a dominance of conspiracy theories in counterculture as something that's more fictitious. Let's think of Thomas Pynchon or Robert Anton Wilson. That would be very typical, but also of popular movies, comic books. V for Vendetta, for example, would be a good example, The Matrix, etc. But what we have seen in the last couple of years is that they regain this political dynamics. So when we thought we were already beyond the stage of the protocols of the wise men of Zion, they're now back with full force.
Conspiracy theorists, I think, have a relatively, especially in the last few years, a relatively prominent position in sort of the political landscape. So, you know, I mean, the first thing that kind of comes to mind here is Alex Jones, right? As sort of one of the most infamous conspiracy theorists of our time. And I think one of the things that characters like him are quite good at doing is sort of challenging the sort of mainstream narratives that you might get from you know, what he might refer to as the establishment media, or what you might get from kind of professionalized journalism sources. And I think sort of part of how it affects the political landscape is by injecting nonsense and conspiracies, as well as kind of all kinds of questionable and junk information into our political landscape. That's part of it. But I think the other part of it is really about kind of creating a space for rejecting what most people hold to be true, to be able to say, I am some kind of transgressive person that understands a truth that all of you don't. And I think that's also a really important part of how that affects the political landscape. It helps generate a certain kind of righteousness, I think, for the people that might believe in or are trying to seek truth in these conspiracy theories.
And I mean, folklorists see conspiracy theories as being ways of processing different kinds of sort of what's now called data voids or lack of information, these sorts of things. And in some sense, also rumors, similarly, are ways in which one sort of, you know, kind of deals with different kinds of information gaps, or so I think that there are many conspiracy theories which you could call harmless. You could also think of them as being in some ways, you know, society's way of dealing with these sort of information voids. But of course, there are others which are quite unhealthy, and you see a lot of rather unhealthy conspiracy theories circulating these days around COVID. And some of these, for example, connecting 5G technology as a transmitter of COVID, these can be quite racist, or so there's or xenophobic, sort of anti-Chinese. So these could be considered rather unhealthy indeed.
I think all of them are dangerous in their own way, but some are more problematic than others, or some are much riskier than others, right? So when you've got conspiracy theories that are really about kind of creating conspiracies about particular groups of people, right, which has been going on for centuries in Western societies, that's really harmful because people go and act on that. So it's at that point that I think we need to be really serious about certain conspiracy theories, right? Is this like the Eurabia conspiracy theory, this nonsense idea that Muslims are migrating to Europe in order to take over the continent, right? This is a very well-worn conspiracy theory in the United States and in Europe, as well as the rest of North America. And the problem there is that it gives political impetus, and it can even give political credibility to racist programs and racist projects. So it's when they're being used in the service of racism or misogyny or hatred towards people with non-binary sexual identities, that's when we really need to step in, right? Yeah, it is probably a little dangerous that there's a conspiracy theory about what happened in 9/11, right? But the conspiracy theories that create harms on individual people and on groups that we in a democratic society believe that need protection, that's when I think we really need to draw the line with conspiracy theory.
Of course, and contrary to what people think, I don't think that conspiracy theories are illogical. There is some logic behind them. There's the people behind them are passionate, and they truly want to change the conversation and truly want to find the truth. And that should be something that's quite pleasing in a sense, that they want them, that they have this drive for truth. The downside, of course, is that the ways they are doing that is flawed. And flawed in the sense that it becomes kind of a belief system that doesn't permit any other logical analysis anymore.
I absolutely do not see conspiracy theories as something negative. Maybe we should go a little bit into the history of the term. The term was actually coined by Karl Popper, liberal philosopher, rationalist philosopher, and as part of his rationalist philosophy, he of course wanted to debunk any form of irrational politics. And that's why he came up with the coinage of the conspiracy theory in a book that he wrote in the last years of the Second World War, under the impression of fascism, actually. In that sense, it's very modern. But on the other hand, maybe if something is literally a conspiracy theory, there are conspiracies. And let's just take one example. Let's take, for example, what has been known about Eastern European secret services after the Cold War. And we only know it because the archives were opened. And we know what those conspiracies actually were. So conspiracies happen. Maybe I can tell you a conspiracy from my own background. I grew up in Berlin. And if you're a Berliner or a German, then the 1968 student movement actually began with a tragic death of a student in a demonstration against the Persian Shah in 1967 in Berlin. And he was killed by a policeman. He was shot by a policeman. Now, it was known back then that this police officer was on the extreme right and that he was a gun freak. Now, we also know, after the end of the Cold War, that he was a double agent for the Stasi and a member of the East German Communist Party, right? I mean, if anybody had told me before 1989 that this police officer had been a Stasi spy, even I would say, no, this is fucking crazy. This is batshit crazy as a conspiracy theory. So very often you see, conspiracies exist. Right? Conspiracy theories can actually be very useful critical tools if it is a theory that is properly developed, that has a proper argumentation, has proper research on it. For example, we have the conspiracy theory that Donald Trump, and by the way, also likely Thierry Baudet, is a pawn of the Russian Secret Service, because they have materials against both of them, so they comply to Russian politics. That's very probable. There is good evidence for that, also in the behavior and the political decisions that those two politicians take. I think it's dangerous to then debunk it by saying, oh, it's just a conspiracy theory. So what we should actually do, we should be more precise in our language. And I think this is where Karl Popper is problematic. We should differentiate conspiracy theories from conspiracy myths. So what we're actually talking about nowadays is our conspiracy myths or even conspiracy mythologies, where it's actually stories that get made up and they get then sold as the truth or as fake news or whatever. But to think in conspiracies and to also develop something like an artistic strategy of conspiracies, I think it's very valid and has been done in the arts with lots of good outcomes.
Well, when I was younger, definitely. There was this conspiracy. Well, the one is really innocent. There was this conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney, the Beatles singer, was dead. And there was a time when I was about, I think, 14 or something, that I was interested in the Beatles. I listened to the music, the old records from my parents. And I read a lot about Paul McCartney not being dead, and there were all these clues supposed to be in the music and the images of the records, which would prove that Paul McCartney was actually very much alive. So I turned the album back to hear the messages in that. And so of course, sometimes I start doubting myself. When you hear conspiracy theorists talk, then you start thinking, well, how do I know for sure that I know the truth?
To me personally, I don't know. I mean, I have to say, I find all conspiracy theories pretty entertaining. And, sometimes you read something and you think it's a conspiracy theory, but it'll confirm my own kind of political beliefs or my own dispositions, right? And then it has some appeal. Right? There might be something that I don't believe in or I don't want to be the case, and I'll go and find a conspiracy theory and it might confirm something that I believe, right? And I think that's where it's really important. We need to take the responsibility to try to sort out what is untrue, what is conspiracy theory, and what we actually can believe and prove, right? And we have to be careful with that. And it's an individual responsibility, but we also have to think about there's big media structures that help to make these things spread too, right? So it's the individual and the structural and the collective that we need to think about.
Conspiracy theories oftentimes they are forms of creative expression and oftentimes are rather well done. I've read a lot of Russian conspiracy theories recently and doing a project on so-called Russian disinformation. And a lot of them are extremely well written, well done cultural productions. These are multiple plot and actor entanglements, which normally there's some kind of plot, there's some sort of secret plot going on in secret. So there's something typical about them. So the genre, but they can also be really well done.
I'm a big fan and follower of conspiracy theories. I very much empathize with conspiracy theories. And I mostly see them as, let's say, wacky entertainment. And also something that is speculative, that allows you to critically think that another picture of the reality, another explanation of the reality can be possible. And I think that's actually a value, and it shouldn't be discredited. I would even say that this is a value in the problematic right-wing conspiracy theories that we have today, like QAnon. The impulse to say something is not right, and we question the mainstream narratives that we get by politics and the media, I think is, first of all, a good critical impulse. And also the impulse to radically question, and also to do that in a speculative and imaginative way. The problem is when you weaponize it. And I think that's something that I personally learned actually from watching Jackie Chan movies. The particular how do you say, the particular martial art of Jackie Chan is you can turn anything into a weapon. Yeah? So if you're in a fight and, I don't know, there's a potato, you can turn the potato into a weapon. Or if there's a carpet, or there's actually very wonderful Jackie Chan movies where he rolls on the carpet and you can turn the carpet into a weapon. Yeah? And that's actually the problem. Yeah? If you take the conspiracy theory and you move it from a realm of speculation, of fiction, maybe also of philosophical reflection even, what is our reality? Where do we live? Do we live in the Matrix? That's also what John Rafman tells us. He tells us also a Alice in Wonderland story in the internet age. The problem is, for example, an alt-writer, or also some other conspiracy theory, an anti-vaxxer could, for example, take this John Rafman video and weaponize it and turn it into an alt-right meme. That's absolutely possible, and that has always happened. That even happened with the Protocols of the Wise Men of Zion, which originally was a political satirical novel, which then was turned into a conspiracy narrative and weaponized by Secret Service, actually.
In the next part, you will see our speakers responding to footage that shows Tim Pool, an American political commentator and YouTuber performing citizen journalism. He is most known for his live streaming of political protest and his engaged style of reporting. In this clip, Pool attends a free speech rally in Boston where users of the infamous 4chan poll were, as Pool claims, LARPing, live action role-playing, by combining attires of American nationalism with symbolisms of their own imaginary online nation, Kakistan. For instance, one can see Pepper the Frog and a parody of the swastika flag used by the Nazis. Pool films the clash of this group with so-called Antifa protesters, anti-fascists. Pool makes the claim that while most of the transgressive behavior from the alt-right is tongue-in-cheek, many Antifa protesters believe, incorrectly, that they are protesting actual fascists. Is it true that these protesters are merely being ironic? And if so, what is the danger thereof?
This is absolutely ridiculous. So behind me, we've got, which I don't even want to call the free speech rally, it's 4chan poll, as my Boston friends have pointed to me. And then over here, we've got a large group of socialists. We've got some individuals in Black Bloc. Now, yeah. They're just yelling that these people are Nazis. Now they're chanting USA, USA. You know what? You know what? You guys that are watching, I'll tell you exactly what this is. This is called LARPing. This is live action role play, where this group thinks that they're fighting Nazis. They aren't. And this group is actually just a bunch of trolls that are trolling the people who think they're fighting Nazis. I think this group is doing everything, for the most part, tongue-in-cheek. I mean, look, they've got Pepe shields. They're chanting "Love Trump's hate," and the guy with the megaphone is making jokes. The people over here are dead serious that they're fighting Nazis. But now I'm gonna walk over to the great land of Kakistan, and I feel like most of what you guys are doing is kind of tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of a joke. They're dead serious. They think that they're in the revolution.
And the thing is, like, a lot of it is a joke, but the free speech part isn't a joke. That's a very serious topic that obviously all of us care about. But yeah, I mean, they actually think. What were they chanting earlier? What were we chanting earlier? What was it?
Love Trump's hate.
Love Trump's hate. Like,
you guys were chanting
so
love.
Took one of their things and just.
It confuses them.
Right. No, we're just chanting their chants back.
I don't think they realize what the dynamic is.
We don't like Nazis either, or like we don't like people who see individuals as part of a collective and then judge them on an individual basis.
I love that there's an anti-USA group in the USA.
You know who does that? Nazis and leftists.
Yeah, I see someone who's ostensibly calling themselves a journalist trying to sanitize by calling it trolling, a form of extreme right activism, and trying to argue that the people who are trying to fight against them, who see what they probably are, is trying to castigate them and to criticize them, right? So here, I think this is actually a pretty good example of how these quote-unquote kind of journalists that come up on YouTube basically try to sanitize extreme right activity.
What you often hear from these right-wing activists is that their free speech is being threatened. I think that is not the case. It's a bit difficult because there's a difference between the European perception of free speech and the American perception of free speech. And although I like the American perception of free speech better, and that's a kind of free speech where you can basically say anything as long as it doesn't incite violence. There are limits to free speech, and free speech concerns everybody. So even if you're left-wing, you have a right to free speech. If you're in the middle ground, there's free speech. So I think it's really strange to claim this only for your own political persuasion. It concerns everybody. It's a universal thing. So I think it's therefore a little bit childish almost.
Yeah, what we see in this video is how you can forge a guerrilla strategy by basically mixing up form and content. Of course, though this YouTube blogger is an alt-right blogger, and what he does is he reframes the situation. And he says only because the trolls are humorous, they're not fascists, which is complete bullshit, of course. Let's say it's even wrong to believe that humor in right-wing or fascist groups is a new thing. The Ku Klux Klan actually started with its costumes and its armors and its rituals also as something that was meant to be satirical and was meant to be hilarious. And at the same time, it was deadly. And we saw it in Charlottesville. I think this was probably shot pre-Charlottesville. I think after Charlottesville, nobody laughed about those trolls with the Pepe signs anymore and thought that they were just joking. But you can also see the weakness, the tactical weakness of the Antifa here, that they kind of doing the alt-righters the favor of fitting their frame and acting exactly like the alt-righters want them to behave.
Well, I mean, what you see is what a couple of theorists, new media theorists, have called the difference between the earnest internet culture and the kind of ironic or insincere internet culture, then played out in the streets. So this is the web moving to the streets, where you have these earnest protesters and these sort of insincere and ironic role-playing groups. That's what I see.
I'll tell you exactly what this is. This is called LARPing. This is live action role play, where this group thinks that they're fighting Nazis. They aren't.
I think this is indeed illustrating a new phenomenon. And this refers to something that I have experienced myself. I was at the annual anti-fascist demonstration in Amsterdam, and what happened there is you had, I don't know how many people demonstrating, maybe 10,000 or more, and there was one single demonstrator, and she was chanting a song which basically was about shooting Thierry Baudet, right? It was one of 10 or 20,000, and there was an alt-right blogger, video blogger, just like this guy, and was filming her. And that became the message of the entire demonstration. That was what the media were talking about. I think this is very typical because these old-fashioned protest forms of going onto the street with 20,000 people were protest forms that were developed for the mass media age. They were developed for the TV camera teams, for the photojournalists to have the big picture of the 10,000 people the next day as the newspaper headline. But this is not how it works today. Today, let's say every one of these 10,000 or 20,000 people will get singled out and their statements will be weaponized. So I think you have to do these protests in a completely different way. So indeed, this has changed. And that's also what I see as a weakness, for example, also of the Dutch left, yeah? That it's still going on the street and making the 20,000. It can be good in some situations. I think it worked for the Black Lives Matter protests, but for specific protest forms, you have to really rethink what you're doing in the streets.
I think it has always been there, and the internet, well, I think the aesthetics are strange, to say the least. That is something new. That these people know how to find each other, that is new. That is something that has to do with the internet. It's the internet coming alive, in a sense, of course, having a real-world manifestation. But after Charlottesville, we also saw that once it became violent, then it dissipates, it goes away. So it gives me the sense that these are kind of middle-class kids who kind of play it safe. You know, it's fine when things are, they can be edgy behind their computer screens. They can be edgy when it's kind of still safe, but when things get rough, you don't see them anymore. That's different from the anti-fascists, by the way. They have always been there, I think, and never been afraid for violence. Is it really internet? I don't know. There's there's a long history of demonstrations, of course, but there's a lot of it right now. Mm-hmm. There must be some link to internet, of course. That the clashes are they're not filtered anymore.
Yeah, I definitely see this as a part of digital culture, contemporary digital culture. So what you see here is is being played out in front of us is the everyday clash, what you see every day on the internet between those who troll and those who take trolls seriously, and so here. The trolls are having their way again, as they often do online, with these earnest protesters.
So I think we should break those questions apart a little bit. So in one sense, we can see this as a pretty good example of the kinds of confrontations that happen, especially in North America, between anti-fascist and fascist groups. So I think that's a pretty good example of what those environments might look like, right? But we've seen much bigger rallies and much bigger counter-protests from anti-fascist groups, and then we see something like this, which is quite a bit smaller. But I think this is actually probably a better example of how there's an entire kind of set of journalists who claim that they're not part of the alt-right, that they're not part of a racist political movement, that go out and basically try to sanitize particular groups, right? And I think that, especially kind of saying, oh, they're doing this tongue-in-cheek, they're just trolling, right? That's really a disingenuous kind of claim to be making. But it allows people like this guy who's holding this Kekistan flag, right? It allows them to operate in a certain amount of ambiguity that prevents their a kind of a response, right? So I think what this clip is really exemplary of are sort of alt-right adjacent journalistic practices that are designed to make it look righteous to be out here trolling, to turn it into jokes when it's obviously not.
But now I'm going to walk over to the great land of Kekistan, and I feel like most of what you guys are doing is kind of tongue-in-cheek, it's kind of a joke. They're dead serious. They think that they're in the revolution.
I think they're in the same tradition, largely. But one difference is that it's not really for punks, but I think the punks started out less political. This is political from the outset. That's the difference, I think. The other ones were more about personal liberty and personal growth and personal liberalization. This is political from the outset, so that sets them kind of apart, and they kind of reject the premises of liberal society, which other movements did not, in that sense. So it's a little bit different, but it's definitely a counterculture, and it's much more fun, I think, if you're young, to be a right-wing activist and to be a very they're left-wing activists.
I mean, groups like these trolls that we see here, right? They're using pretty standard subcultural tactics, if you want to call it that, right? They're getting together in a place, they're showing their kind of, they're showing off their aesthetics, they're showing off the kind of symbols that they use, right? So that's pretty standard, and we've seen that in all kinds of different groups throughout history, right? But I think maybe if we try to take a step back, right? If we look at, for example, Black Lives Matter today, right? There's a lot of symbols that they use. There's a lot of chants, right? Just like you have with these fascist individuals here that are in this park, right? But there's a fundamental difference. And I think this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because what we're seeing more and more is that the alt-right is trying to take the tactics of left-wing protest and left-wing counterculture and then trying to make it into its own, right? But if we look at it closely, we can see a really simple and fundamental difference, right? So if they're appropriating some of the strategies of Black Lives Matter, right, that doesn't mean that they're both making an equal claim or that this claim is somehow morally acceptable, right? So for Black Lives Matter, what you're talking about is the call for the protection of a group of people who are, beyond any doubt, with certainty we can say, are being more oppressed by the police than anyone else, right? So the claim we need the recognition of our equality is fundamentally important, and it's really something that we can kind of put our moral backing behind, right? Because it's true, and it's about the recognition of another group's equality, which has been denied for centuries, right? Whereas what's going on with these kind of groups of white identity politics is they're saying, oh, we're victimized, oh, we're marginalized, trying to steal that language from groups like that are fighting against anti-black racism, for example, right? So they're synthesizing and creating this false claim, right? But the reality is they're not marginalized in the United States or North America, where this is probably happening, right? There's no evidence for that to be the case, but they're creating that sense, right? So what we can see is that one claim is morally acceptable. We have been denied equality and we want the restitution of that equality. Where another group is saying, essentially they're inventing the idea that their equality is being denied, and they're saying we want our equality to be recognized. And what that really is a call for domination over other groups. It's a call for superiority, right? So we can draw a line, and it's not really that complicated. We can actually tell quite clearly, right? If we look at the data, we look at the information that's out there, we can see that one claim is morally valid, the other one is completely not.
I would argue that there is not such a big difference between today's trolls and the trolls of the past. If you mention Dada, if you mention punks, yes, those were trolling movements. Almost all avant-garde movements were trolling movements. I mean, the surrealists themselves with their disruptions, or the situationists, the provos were trolls, kabouters even. I mean, literally, they called themselves trolls. So, and then I think it would, on top of that, be wrong to assume that, in the past, the trolls were largely left-wing or progressive or however you want to call them. No, the first trolls were the Italian futurists. The publication of the Italian Futurist Manifesto through Marinetti in 1909 in the Figaro as a paid advertising was a classical act of media trolling. Yeah? It was the planting of a meme, and it was a right-wing meme. So yes, and the same also in punk culture. I mean, in punk culture, especially in the beginnings, when punk was not so clearly aligned on the political left, and you had fascist punks, which then later became the Nazi rockers and the skinheads, etc. So yes, I think the best thing is if we think of this in terms of the Belgian political philosopher Chantal Mouffe, who describes political forces as attempts hegemonic forces. Trolling is a form of practiced hegemony and hegemony claims. And by itself, it doesn't have a clear political color.
And this group is actually just a bunch of trolls that are trolling the people who think they're fighting Nazis.
I mean, do you think you need to take trolls seriously? So there are different approaches to trolls. So the one approach that I thought was kind of interesting is how Wikipedia deals with trolls. Wikipedia doesn't just ignore trolls, so as the saying goes, don't feed the trolls, but rather they use a kind of flame, what I call a flame retardation strategy. So instead of engaging in a flame war, they delay their responses. So they don't respond right away, and then they will sort of lock down a particular article, but that lockdown is only for 24 hours or a short period of time. So it just calms down, it diffuses the situation, and I think diffusing is one of the better ways of working with trolls.
Yes, because they are there.
Angela Nagel is an academic who has written the influential book Kill All Normies, Online Culture Wars from 4chan and Tumblr to Trump and the Alt-Right. In this book, she chronicles the rise of transgressive and reactionary counterculture on the fringe corners of the web. In this clip, she is interviewed for the VPRO documentary Tegenlicht, Trump, Trollen and Cherry, in which the creators try to understand the impact of irony, or perhaps the seriousness of a fringe web culture that parodies hate symbols and meshes it with popular culture to create a pastiche or simulacrum of hateful ideologies. Nagel makes the provocative case that what these youngsters are doing is attacking hegemonic culture that is the outgrowth of a left-wing counter-movement in the 1960s. Like the alt-right, this progressive movement used a transgressive style to insert its own perspective and ideology into the discourse. Is Nagel right to draw this parallel between the transgressive left and right? Is contemporary hegemonic culture so-called left-wing?
They regard themselves as a counterculture to the mainstream media. They are basically saying the left's culture war that has been there since the 60s is now the establishment, and we're pushing against it. And we have to admit that that cultural left kind of has become hegemonic, and so they're not lying when they say that. And for them, just to give you an example, since the book has come out, I have had parents say to me that they're worried that their teenage sons are going alt-right. So when that's happening, it's obvious that in a culture that already kind of, fetishizes or kind of romanticizes, I should probably say, youth, that youth and counterculture and avant-garde and newness and all that stuff, it's like they're taking that energy of the left and it's all being now channeled into the right.
What we see now is that the dominant counterculture is no longer on the left side of the political spectrum. But we've also learned that from different scholars that the counterculture, whilst seemingly on the left side of the political spectrum, also has some portions of it that are on the other side of it. So it's never that clear cut what the politics of counterculture are. But nevertheless, these days I think it's quite clear that alternative culture is that the dominant alternative culture is of a particular political bent, and I don't think that should necessarily cause us to rethink the relationship between the establishment and counterculture, but or the existence of the two. But it does give us pause in romanticizing how productive counterculture could be, because the current counterculture doesn't appear to, as of yet, be all that productive.
Well, just look at 2020 and how is that going so far? I think there are many countercultures right now, and many people are craving change right now. So everything is in flux. And to be honest, I think this whole alt-right movement is going away slowly. They're having a hard time. You see that even with the populists, for instance. So everybody wants something different right now. So the establishment, the neoliberal establishment will fall in the end. The problem is who will take up the next mantle. Will it be the right-wing or more universal liberty, left-wing type of person? I've become more optimistic about it being the last one, me being kind of leftist, but we're not there yet.
So I think one of the things we need to do here is be a little critical about what we think the establishment is, right? And in this clip, this is Angela Nagel, right?
Correct.
So in this clip, Angela Nagel is making the claim that the values of the countercultural left, whatever that exactly is, the values of the countercultural left have now become hegemonic. And so then what we have to do is we start thinking in this kind of binary as a clash between the establishment, which is some kind of mythical object, and then we also have the counterculture, which again is also mythologized, right? And the notion is often that the establishment is what's bad and counterculture is what's good, right? I think we should totally try to problematize this. First off, I think what Nagel said was actually pretty much nonsense, right? The idea that the ideas of the countercultural left have become hegemonic, that doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't think that that tracks empirically whatsoever. Now, I don't know what she's referring to as the countercultural left here, but maybe let's think about in terms of the civil rights movement in the United States, right? The ideas about equality and equal opportunity and all of these kinds of things, right? So at that point, it was really just making the claim for the equal recognition of black political subjects in the United States, right? And that didn't mean that all of a sudden, all of the racial problems in the United States disappeared, right? If she's right in terms of the idea that those ostensibly left-wing ideas have become hegemonic, then why is it that we still have the level of racial discrimination in the United States that we have today? Why is it that women are still paid less than men, right? So I think it's nonsense that somehow the hegemonic ideas of the countercultural left are somehow found somewhere in politics. I mean, you can look at the Democratic Party in the United States, it's not even close to many of those ideals, right? I mean, there might be lip service paid towards those points, but it's not really what we see. But I also think that maybe we should do away with these terms like the establishment and counterculture. What we might want to do is try to think instead about different clashes, different interests, and different values. And once we start doing that, we can start looking at, okay, well, who's in power in a given country, right? And what are the networks that support that power and challenge it? And what we start to find is that things are a lot more complicated than a simple binary, that there's associations being formed and breaking apart. And it's really our job to sort of sort out what are the values that we want to foster in our democratic societies, and what are the ones that we think don't have a place in it, right? And we need to have a debate and embrace the fact that there's a clash, right? But not rely on these kind of simplistic ideas, such as, you know, just a simple counterculture versus an establishment, right? And it, you know, at what point do we say that the alt-right isn't kind of part of the establishment when you've got Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller in the White House today? Or, well, Bannon obviously is no longer in the White House. Let's be glad about that. But, you know, these ideas are not far away from the centers of power on the planet. So the idea that you know, we're talking about some kind of establishment that the alt-right counterculture has come and, you know, completely reshaped, I think that that's, it's a really simplistic way of looking at what we're actually dealing with in contemporary democracies.
I mean, I agree that a term like alternative doesn't say anything. It has no contents. It only says I'm on the other side, yeah? And I'm on the other side of whatever I perceive as the main side. Yeah? So, but I would even say it's nothing new again. Yeah? So in the 1930s, it was not just Marinetti, but it was so many artists and intellectuals, Ezra Pound, Céline, etc., Heidegger, who were countercultural fascists at that time. You could even say that their impulses even have been taken over, both in critical theory, but also in the arts. There is a mixed legacy of you could say, both extreme right and both extreme left cultural and intellectual influences. By the way, I think that has always been a strength, particularly of French philosophy, to kind of also look at the adversary and say what the adversary has as ideas and try to kind of appropriate them in your own ways. I think that's the way to go to do and not to put a taboo on the thought of the enemy. Or also think of, for example, how the political philosophy of Carl Schmitt has been appropriated, for example, by Chantal Mouffe. Her political philosophy is totally based, you could say, on the originally fascist political philosophy of Carl Schmitt. I agree that terms like underground and establishment, they have no ethical value, and they don't even have political content. They only say something about the social position and the form of organization. But they're nevertheless important. So for example, if you're talking about the arts, I think there's really a structural and important difference between an art institution and an art initiative. And that kind of is in my mind because I've been involved in an art initiative in Rotterdam, the Player myself, and we just dissolved. And we came up with a working definition. We said actually an artist initiative is always made by the people, and you cannot replace the people. And an institution like the school where I work, everyone needs to be replaceable. That's the definition even of good management. Yeah? So that's just one example of the difference between institutional and non-institutional, or you could say underground and mainstream. So I think these differences are important and they do exist, and I would always argue with people who say, no, that this is outmoded thinking. I don't think it's outmoded thinking. It's just that they are not any value propositions in themselves.
They are basically saying the left's culture war that has been there since the 60s is now the establishment.
Yeah, a bit, I'm probably a little bit part of the establishment, right? I mean, I work at a major university. I've come through establishment institutions most of my life. I was told I need to go through those institutions to do what I wanted to do in my life, etc. Yeah, so yes, I'm probably part of the establishment, right? But I've also spent most of my life trying to fight against a lot of the values that are still enshrined in this establishment, right? And that's the point, right? It's a useless term because there's complexities within it, right? There's parts of the establishment that I think are valuable, right? The establishment being, I don't know, what, the Declaration of the European, Convention on Human Rights, that's establishment, and I think that that's really valuable, right? But I think that Europe's got a lot of work to do when it comes to welcoming migrants, right? So it's not like you can be part of the establishment and then you embrace all of it, or you're not part of the establishment and you criticize it, right? One always stands in some kind of position on this continuum, and you have to decide which values you want to militate for yourself.
Well, as a university professor, I think I would be counted as such. But I mean, I don't necessarily self-identify as an establishment figure, no. Yes, I'm a journalist, I'm 45, I'm white. As a journalist, I know many other journalists, and I have quite some power, I think. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I absolutely see myself as part of the establishment because I work at an art school 4 days a week. So I'm an institutional representative, and we are a public school. So that also means that we
embody the values of mainstream society and of the political system. So I cannot pretend that I'm outside that system. No, absolutely not.